We're going to be in Acts 16. Acts chapter 16. Here, you have mine, and I'll use the script. I made a copy. We'll start in verse 4. If you remember, we were talking a little bit about Paul sharing this message that he got from the elders and the apostles in Jerusalem with the folks in South Galatia. While he's there, he runs into Timothy, and he gets Timothy to go on with him and go on his travels. Timothy's just the first one that he kind of picks up along the way, and I had never noticed it until I was going over it this time. So after all these years, you finally stuff dawns on you. Chapter 16, verse 4, as they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit for preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. All right. There's two or three things that I don't want us to miss here. The first thing is how specifically the Holy Spirit was directing where Paul went. Now, you got to figure that Paul could have gone anywhere and done amazing work. When he went into Galatia, there were churches in all these little towns. They've already appointed elders. This is a second visit from Paul. Maybe they've had another visit from Barnabas. So things are going really well in southern Galatia. They start going farther west. And so to go farther west, you go through Asia Minor. So all those places that get the book of Revelation, Ephesus, Smyrna, Thyatira, Philadelphia, Laodicea, all those places are in that region. And Paul thinks, well, maybe this would be a good time for me to start some churches in this area. And the Holy Spirit says, nope, this is not where we want you to work. We don't know who else might have been there. The Apostle John ends up there late in his life, and there are churches in all these places. So I don't know whether John helped to start them. Barnabas and John Mark may have ventured farther over into that area while they were on their missionary journey. I don't know where those churches came from. But Paul is told, no, this is not where I want you to go. So they go a little bit farther to the west, and they kind of point their map north, and Bithynia is just to the northwest of Asia Minor, and the Holy Spirit says, nope, that's not where I want you to go either. So Paul's getting a lot of refusals from the Holy Spirit until he gets to Troas, and he stays overnight at Troas and has a dream, and in the dream there's a man from over in Macedonia. What towns, what cities are in Macedonia that come to mind? There's one really important one in the life of Paul. That's where Philippi is. Yeah. Right? So when he sees a man from Macedonia, think, oh, that's Philippi. And he ends up doing a lot of good work in and around Philippi and then goes west to Thessalonica. So he has this dream. So finally the Holy Spirit tells him where he wants him to go. So he gets turned down as far as going into Asia Minor. He gets turned down as far as going into Bithynia. But then the Holy Spirit says, here's where I really want you to go. So it gives him a vision from this man of Macedonia. And something changes in verse 10. Okay? After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. What's different in that verse? Yeah, it's a we passage. So Luke joins them, and this is the part that never dawned on me. Luke joins them at Troas. So So don't know if Troas was where he was from, if he was doing ministry there, why Luke was in Troas. But when Paul and his group get there, Luke leaves with them from Troas and goes on to do more ministry with Paul and with Timothy and Silas. So Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke kind of become a tremendous foursome that travels to Macedonia. Mm-hmm.
So they would have had to have gone by ship to keep from going through Asia Minor.
Well,
that's verse 11.
Yeah, it says they caught a ship and went, but you had to kind of go across. There's a body of water that comes up between Bithynia, Asia Minor, between that area and Macedonia. So you have to sail over anyway. But yeah, they eventually had to get in a boat. But it wasn't that he couldn't be in Asia Minor, just that he couldn't be. Don't stay there and set up shop. Now he ends up in Ephesus for 3 years, so he stays in Asia Minor for quite a while later on. But on this trip, Holy Spirit's pushing him west. Just keep going, and then he gives him this vision so that he can go to Macedonia. So we got ready, left for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So Luke counts himself immediately as part of the preaching part of the ministry, not just a companion or Paul's personal physician. Some people refer to him that way, and he may have been, but he seems to have been very interested in the ministry part of the thing as well. This has from Troas, we put out to sea, sailed straight for Samothrace. The next day we went to Neapolis, and from there we traveled to Philippi. So Luke the guy's really interested in making sure people know where they were. He's the kind of guy that if you went to Luke's house and he had one of those old slide projectors, that you would be there all night watching pictures of, and then we stopped at the Esso station and there was this little girl, isn't she cute? And she was drinking a Coke. And so I took her picture, and so Luke would just give you every detail about everything. But when they're traveling, he tells you every place that they set their foot, every place the ship docked. He lets you know where they've been. But of course, the main point is in verse 12. From there, we traveled to Philippi. Right? Philippi is where they need to be. That's what they're going to. That's where the great ministry is going to happen. So when they get to Philippi, it is a Roman colony and the leading city of the district of Macedonia. He says we stayed there several days. When it says it's a Roman colony, one of the things about Philippi that was important to their culture, to the church as it gets started, is that lots of patriotism for Rome. It was one of those places where if you were in the military and you wanted to retire to a place where there were lots of military and probably little parades that you could be in and folks would salute you going down the street, Philippi was that kind of place. So it's a very special kind of town, very special kind of city, and there are very few Jews living there. It would not have been a comfortable place for Jews to have settled. It would have been too much rub with the Roman folks. So there are very few Jews. And we find this out because there's not a synagogue in Philippi. You have to have 10 adult male Jews before you could have a synagogue. That was the definition. That was the rule. And evidently they didn't. So instead of having a synagogue, they had a meeting place. And Paul just assumed where the meeting place would be, being Jewish and kind of knowing the way these things work. And he finds out where it is, and he goes down and meets there. So look at verse 13. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. So instead of a synagogue in Philippi, they had a place of prayer. It really is more authentic to the original synagogues. I know I've mentioned before, the word synagogue means together. And it originally meant the ones who got together. And it started in Babylon, and it started by the river. When people couldn't go to the temple and there was no place for them to go worship, they met by the river. So it became kind of customary that would be a place that if you were Jewish and you were looking for people that were like-minded, that maybe they would be by the river. So Paul goes down and he finds the place of prayer, and it says, we sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. So again, not enough adult males to have a synagogue, but there were some women who were faithful and who went down there and used that as a place of prayer. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, who was a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. So here's a woman from Thyatira. Where is Thyatira? I won't make you look. It's in Asia Minor. So the Holy Spirit tells Paul, no, you can't preach in Asia Minor. Let me send you to Macedonia, where you can convert people from Asia Minor. So Paul gets over there, and he meets Lydia, who is a seller of purple cloth. She's got a business. She seems to be the head of her own household, the head of her own business, and is doing quite well, thank you. But she was interested in spiritual things, and she was interested in the God of Israel. She wasn't Jewish, she wasn't a lawkeeper, but she was a worshiper of God. So she was somebody maybe a little bit like Timothy, familiar with God. Somebody had gotten him connected with God, but he wasn't circumcised, wasn't a lawkeeper. So she's somebody who knows Yahweh and wants to pray to him and finds a place where she can pray to him. I love the sentence, the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. What does that mean? Opened her heart.
Made her receptive to.
Okay, made her receptive. Did he not make other people receptive? Did God intervene in such a way as to direct her above and beyond the others to be receptive? It's a difficult concept, right? We don't want to get to a place where we're saying God is a respecter of persons, and you've got 10 ladies sitting there, and only one of them is interesting to God, and so he softens her heart and helps her to obey. But at the same time, God is sovereign, and God can help people to listen and to obey. The Holy Spirit, the message itself, has got to be part of the equation, that it softened her heart when she heard the message about Messiah, that she paid attention to that. But it's just an interesting way that Luke says this, that the Lord opened her heart so that she would respond. I don't think he closed other hearts. I think he was just open to her being open and helped her to move in the right direction.
I think the fact that she was there made her more receptive. I mean, she was there by choice. She wasn't there because her father was Jewish and made her go to synagogue.
Yeah, this is all her.
All her.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't know how many other people might have been there, how many other people might have heard the message. If this was 3 or 4 people, or if it was 20 people, we don't have any idea. Just Lydia, because Lydia becomes very important to the story of the church at Philippi. Her house becomes the house church. Where she is staying is where everybody that we know of ends up being part of the church and staying there. When she and the members of her household, verse 15, were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. So when Paul and Silas and Luke and Timothy are finished baptizing the family, or baptizing the household, she says, just come stay with me. So they're brand new acquaintances. All they have in common is their belief in Messiah. And she says, if you really believe me that I believe in Messiah, then I want you to come stay at my house. So immediately there's hospitality for this group of guys. As far as we know, there's not a woman in their group. We've got Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke. We find out later that there's some other guys that are kind of coming and going that are part of this group. And she just says, you just come stay at my house. So as time goes by, she's kind of the original starting point of the church in Philippi. So from time to time we check back in on her and how things are going in her house. When they leave from Philippi, we lose the we passage. Right? As long as we're in Philippi and there's groups, then Luke is still a we passage. When they leave Philippi, then it's no longer a we passage. So Luke stays there for a while. We don't know if he just stayed in Lydia's place and continued the ministry to the folks who'd been converted. Right, next week we'll look at the Philippian jailer. Right, we have a whole nother family. The jailer and all of his family are converted. So we're starting to have some folks in the congregation. And evidently Lydia is kind of the place where people get together. She's the house that has all the hospitality when they are coming into the Lord. And if Luke is doing the preaching when Paul and Silas and Timothy leave, then he would be the center point. So wherever he is, that's where the congregation is going to come together as well. So a little bit of conjecture, but I'm pretty sure that that's what's going on in Philippi. We find out later on that Philippi is the most likely congregation to support the Apostle Paul. Right? I've got a couple of passages written down here. Let me see my Bible. Look at chapter 18, Acts 18. Verse 1, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. He met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see him, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. And so when he first gets to Corinth, he's there by himself. He doesn't have any funding. He doesn't have any support. So he does what we call tent making these days. He's a preacher, but he supports himself by having another job. So Paul is making tents with Aquila and Priscilla and doing okay. But then you have Silas and Timothy who come. Now, who doesn't come? Luke, right? He doesn't say when we arrived. He names the ones that went. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, then Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching. So look over at 2 Corinthians 11. And Paul makes a comment to the Corinthians about it. Second Corinthians 11, starting in verse 5. He says, I don't think I am in the least inferior to those super apostles. They may indeed be untrained as a speaker, or I may indeed be untrained as a speaker, but I do have knowledge. We've made this perfectly clear to you in every way. Was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. And when I was with you and needed something, I was not a burden to anyone because the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied what I needed. I've kept myself from being a burden to you in any way and will continue to do so. As surely as the truth of Christ is in me, nobody in the regions of Achaia will stop this boasting of mine. Why? Because I don't love you? God knows that I do. So Paul says, the reason that I feel so proud about my work with you is that I didn't charge you for it. But then he turns around and says, I charged somebody else. It was the folks at Philippi who footed the bill. And you think about the folks at Philippi, and you've got a woman living there who is business owner has, she's selling purple cloth. Some of it was probably blue, but, rich colored cloth. She's probably a fairly wealthy woman. I wonder how much of the contribution that was coming from Philippi to Corinth to help take care of Paul and Silas and Timothy in their work at Corinth started out from Lydia's house. We don't have any way of knowing, but there were folks up there who had a little bit of money and wanted to see the gospel spread, so they just took over paying for Paul's needs while he was in Corinth. Now, there are some churches that have misunderstood what Paul is saying and have said that you just shouldn't have full-time paid preachers. That, Paul is saying that it's a bad idea to pay a guy to preach. It's better if he does it for free. And it's fine if that's what folks want to do, if they want to donate their time and have a different job. But it's not what Paul was talking about. Paul was saying, I was taken care of. I just was taken care of by someone else. And the church at Philippi constantly is part of that. When he gets ready to go to Jerusalem, the church at Philippi helps to support him to go do that. The big contribution for the saints at Jerusalem that are suffering because of the famine, they're a big part of that. It says that they begged us to take contributions from them. He said they weren't doing very well financially, but they didn't want to be left out. So they wanted to make sure that they sent some money with us for the folks at Jerusalem. So anyway, this church at Philippi is a big deal in the ministry of Paul. Why was Paul in Philippi? Because the Holy Spirit said, don't go to Asia Minor. And he said, well, how about Bithynia? And the Holy Spirit said, no, don't go to Bithynia. And then a guy shows up in his dream and says, well, come on over here to Macedonia. That's why he's in Macedonia. Holy Spirit was very specific, getting him to the right place at the right time to do the right thing. And then that little church really flourished. If you read the letter that he wrote to Philippi, there's a lot of praise, a lot of camaraderie that he had with that congregation. And he thanks them for always being ready to help him out to do the work that he needed to do. So, really neat congregation, all starting with that one woman whose heart the Lord opened up.
Lydia and the purple cloth.
Yeah.
Purple cloth was the color of royalty. And the dye that they get the purple, where they got the purple dye was from a tiny little shellfish. And it took about 1,000 of these little shellfish to get enough to dye one cloth for, so these would be very expensive cloths.
Yeah.
It would take a while to do it too, wouldn't it?
Yeah, she was a Neiman Marcus dealer.
Picking open 1,000 shellfish to take it. So, yeah, she probably was quite.
Seemed like I read somewhere about the slaves that they made to open those things, and how you could always tell one because their hands were purple and they couldn't get it off. That it was just constant, that they got dyed that color. Yeah, it was high dollar stuff. So, like I say, maybe, Paul's ministry was heavily funded through her household. The jailer, when he comes in with his family, he was a member of the military, right? It's a military outpost, so maybe he's making pretty good dollar. Don't know who had how much, but it was enough that Paul was cared for from afar instead of having to charge the Corinthians for it. And that's not a bad model for the 21st century. Large congregations should probably start adopting rural congregations so that they can afford to have someone come and stay with them and preach for them without having to foot the bill completely on their own. It's getting to the place that a lot of rural congregations don't have enough contribution to support what guys think they ought to be paid these days. And of course, just if you've got a bachelor's degree, entry-level jobs used to be $30,000, now they're $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. So, guys that are coming out of school are expecting to make more. So a lot of them are ending up going to urban centers where they can make more money, larger congregations. And then the smaller congregations that need them so badly are hurt even more. And then if you go without a preacher for a while because you can't afford what they think they ought to be paid, then folks start drifting away because they don't have any shepherding or they don't have a preacher, And, so it's a self-perpetuating problem. I just wonder if larger congregations, instead of some of the things they might be doing elsewhere, might just adopt smaller congregations.
The one in Buffalo Gap was that way.
Buffalo Gap's that way, yeah. One of the things they're doing instead is broadcasting. She said the church at Buffalo Gap is that way. Buffalo Gap is just outside of Abilene. It's one of our favorite places. There's Abilene State Park is really pretty. And the church at Buffalo Gap is about the friendliest bunch of folks we've run into, just, showed up for church. And we went on a Wednesday night expecting to, get whatever they were studying. And it was eating meeting Wednesday night. And they fed us well and visited with us for a long time. And so we went back Sunday morning the next time. We got to worship with them. So they're a neat bunch.
But they're paid by the minister there is supported by the Abilene Church of Christ.
Yeah.
And then he's sent with a group too, so they have a song leader.
Oh yeah, that's right. They got a group from, I don't know if it's Highland or whatever congregation it is in Abilene,
and several young adults
that adopted them and sent a group to kind of bolster their numbers a little bit and help with the finances.
I think the larger church probably are more missionary oriented.
You hope so, if they've got the funding. Another thing
rather than adopting rural.
Yeah. Another thing they're doing is church plants where they're putting up a big screen. And in fact, Oklahoma Christian University just started a new program where they will provide all the song service and the preaching. You do Lord's Supper and announcements, I think. And pretty much they do everything else, and you just have a big screen and they broadcast. So if a congregation only has 5 or 6 people, they could still get together in their small group and have a worship experience with, a large group, So we're doing what we can, is I guess where we are as a people, that because there's so many rural congregations that are in the same boat and trying to figure out what to do next.